In 1997, Mitch Albom, who's a sports columnist for the Detroit Free Press, he wrote a book about one of his college professors, Morris Schwartz, that became a New York Times bestseller. So Mitch had reconnected with his professor when he heard the news that Morris, or Maury as everyone called him, was dying from ALS. So even after he received this terminal diagnosis, Maury refused to shrink from death. He engaged as fully as possible with people, saying that his illness had not rendered him useless. Well, at the time when all of this happened, the newspaper that Mitch worked for went on strike. And so he had this extra time on his hand, and he decided every Tuesday that he would visit with Maury. Well, on the third Tuesday visit, Mitch asked Maury if he had any regrets. I want you to listen to Maury's answer. Mitch, he said, the culture doesn't encourage you to think about such things until you're about to die. We're so wrapped up with egotistical things, career, family, having enough money, meeting the mortgage, getting a new car, fixing the radiator when it breaks. We're involved in trillions of little acts just to keep going. So we don't get into the habit of standing back and looking at our lives and saying, is this all? Is this all I want? Is something missing? He paused. You need someone to probe you in that direction. It won't just happen automatically. Well, Mitch thought about Maury's words that week and realized he was right. He needed someone to push him into considering the serious matters of life. And so the next Tuesday, he came prepared with a list of topics that he wanted to discuss with Maury. Here is his list: death, fear, aging, greed, marriage, family, society, forgiveness, and a meaningful life. When I read this account a couple weeks ago, I immediately thought about the book of Ecclesiastes. And though I doubt he realized it, Maury was echoing the author of this book, because the author of Ecclesiastes wants us to step back. And he wants to look at our lives and ask, is this all? Is there something missing? Like the author of Ecclesiastes, he wants to push us in the direction of thinking about our death before we're lying on our deathbed. The author of Ecclesiastes invites us to ask questions about life and death, about fear and aging, marriage and family, greed and forgiveness, and especially how to ask him about a meaningful life. How do we live a meaningful life? In his excellent book on Ecclesiastes, David Gibson writes, he says, Ecclesiastes is a meditation on what it means to be alive in a world that God made and called good, yet which has also gone so very wrong, often in very catastrophic ways. Reading and meditating on this book should cause us to ask questions like, at the end of my life, what will the surplus be? What will I leave behind that will count as a lasting monument to all my effort? Now, asking and answering questions like this, it's hard. Like, it takes a lot of work. It's a lot of discomfort to wrestle with these ultimate questions of purpose and meaning. I think if the author of Ecclesiastes had presented these questions to us, but it was in a comfortable setting. Maybe he was sort of a college philosophy professor there with his whiteboard. If he presented these questions that way, we'd be tempted to smile and zone out and do just enough to pass the class. But questions like these demand our full attention. They demand complete focus. And so the author of Ecclesiastes doesn't approach these questions like a grandfatherly professor with a whiteboard who we can easily dismiss. Like, his method of teaching, his method of pushing us to answer deep questions is much more intense. One author describes it this way. He says, Ecclesiastes sounds like a crazed man downtown. He smells like he hasn't bathed. He looks like it too. And as we pass by, he won't stop glaring at us and beckoning to us that our lives are built on illusions and that we're all going to die. So most of us choose to get our lunch at a different shop on a less dreary corner of town. For the past 9 months, I've been studying the book of Ecclesiastes, preparing for this series of sermons, and I agree it's uncomfortable. That sitting with Ecclesiastes is a little bit like sitting in the living room of your dying professor as his body withers and he's unable to breathe. It's like slowing down and listening to that crazed man on the street corner. If you sit with this book, it will challenge you. it will cause you discomfort, it will make you squirm, and it might just save your life. Like it might revolutionize your perspective. You will be tempted as we go through this book to move away from it, to drive to a safer part of the Bible. Don't. Be willing to sit in the discomfort of tough questions. Be willing to linger where it smells a little. See, the book of Ecclesiastes does not yield itself to simple, easy answers. It's not a sitcom that resolves in 22 minutes by tying everything into a cute little bow as the credits roll. But that's okay, because life isn't that way either. So this morning, as we look at chapter 1 of Ecclesiastes, I just want to make 2 points. I want you to see that Ecclesiastes is honest about life, and that in the honesty, we find hope. So in these first 18 verses, the writer of Ecclesiastes makes 3 honest observations about life. None of them are positive. None of them are encouraging, but they're true. And so we've got to face them. Here's the first truth. Life is fleeting. Life is fleeting. Look at verse 2. Absolute futility, says the teacher. Absolute futility, everything is futile. What does a person gain for all his efforts that he labors at under the sun? A generation goes, a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. Now the word futility translates the Hebrew word hevel. And so depending upon your Bible translation, you might have a different word. Maybe yours says meaningless or vanity. But the word hevel is most often translated breath, wind, vapor. For instance, in Psalm 39:5, it says, "In fact, you have made my days just inches long, and my lifespan is as nothing to you. Yes, every human being stands as only a vapor." I think that's the best translation, is a vapor. I don't believe the writer of Ecclesiastes is saying that everything is worthless. He is telling us, though, that everything is fleeting. Life is like the steam that comes out of the oven when you open it to check on dinner. Life is like the mist that's on your mirror after you step out of the shower. Life is like the fog that maybe you drove through on your way to church this morning. Like, it's real. But it doesn't last long, and it's absolutely impossible to hold on to it. In the New Testament epistle of James, he reminds us of the same truth. He says this, "Yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring, what your life will be. For you are like vapor that appears for a little while, then vanishes." In fact, the phrase in verse 2 is actually hevel of hevels, or vapor of vapors. And I think we're supposed to make a comparison here between us, who are vapor of vapors, and God, who is holy of holies. See, it's reminding us we're not like God. God is holy. He's glorious. Like, there is this weightiness to who God is, but we're just vapor. Holy of holies compared to vapor of vapors is like a diamond compared to a piece of plastic. It's like steel compared to a feather. Like, here's God, weighty and fixed and unchanging. Here are we. We're flimsy and we're fleeting. Since our lives are fleeting, what do we really accomplish with all of our effort? What difference is made with our blood, sweat, and tears? Like, that's the question of verse 3. I think it's an important question to ask. Like, what's the point? What am I trying to accomplish? What is gained by all my effort? The word gain in verse 3 is an important word in Ecclesiastes. It's used 10 times as a way to push us out of our robotic existence. We're supposed to ask questions about what we're doing and why we're doing it. What gain is there in going to work? What gain is there in making money? What gain is there in a good reputation? What gain is there in wisdom? What gain is there in worshiping God? What gain is there in making good decisions? What gain am I accomplishing with my life? Like, what am I doing? And Jesus asks a similar question. He says, "For what does it benefit someone to gain the whole world and yet lose his life? What can anyone give in exchange for his life?" Are you asking these questions? You should be. If life really is fleeting, then shouldn't you try to make the most of it? Shouldn't you try to figure out why you're here, why you exist, what this means for your choices every day? Not only is your life fleeting, but so is everyone else's. It says in verse 4, each generation is like a foggy morning. When the sun comes up, it burns it away, and the next one replaces it. So what do you know about the people who lived in South America between AD 1500 and AD 1600? I'll give you a 100-year span. What do you know about the people on that continent? What if I gave you 200 years? 1500 to 1700. You know what? I'll be nice. I'll give you 1,000 years. From 900 AD to 1900 AD, the entire continent of South America. Tell me what you know about the people. Yeah, I thought nothing. None of us do, right? Unless you're a history teacher who just happens to remember what you studied in that one college class. You know nothing about them. Why? Because generations come and they go. And this is one of the lessons the Bible is trying to teach us. The 5th chapter of the Bible is the first genealogy, which is a list of a family line, a family tree. 10 generations in one chapter. All those generations came and they went like a vapor. So I want to challenge you students to ask someone with gray hair about how fast time goes. So that's your assignment today. Before the day ends, ask someone with gray hair or someone who should have gray hair, ask them about how fast time goes. Because it may seem crazy to you now, but 10 years from today, you'll turn on the radio and a song will play and you'll be like, I love that song. That was my favorite song in high school. And then you'll hear the person welcome you to the oldies station. Or you're going to look at a picture and you're going to see the clothes that you're wearing and how dated and out of style they seem. And you'll hear yourself saying these words, I guarantee it. Well, it was cool back then. A couple of years ago, my grandma passed away. And a number of my cousins were there. And they found actually an old VCR and these old family videos. And they put them on and we started watching them. They were of ourselves as kids on family camping trips. It was a reminder why I don't like family camping trips. But as we were sitting there watching these, I started doing the math, and I realized that my dad on those videos was younger than I was sitting there, which is really weird because my dad has always been old. It's weird when you find yourself at an age where your parents seemed old to you, but you don't seem like you're that old. Life is fleeting. Here's truth number 2. Life is repetitive. Does life ever feel mundane to you? Do you ever feel like you're stuck in a rut and you don't, no matter how hard you try, you just can't get out of it? Well, you're not the only one. In the next set of verses, here's what the writer of Ecclesiastes is showing us. He's showing us how constant repetition is actually built into our world, into nature itself. The same things happen over and over. So he points out the sun, he points out the wind, he points out streams to make his point. Look at verse 5. He says the sun rises and the sun sets panting. It hurries back to the place where it rises. Gusting to the south, turning to the north, turning goes the wind, and the wind returns in its cycles. All the streams flow to the sea, yet the sea is never full. To the place where the streams flow, there they flow again. On the album Dark Side of the Moon, the British rock band Pink Floyd sang these lyrics which could have been a meditation on Ecclesiastes 1. I doubt they were, but they could have been. Here's what they wrote. Ticking away the moments that make up a dull day, you fritter and waste the hours in an offhand way, kicking around on a piece of ground in your hometown, waiting for someone or something to show you the way. Tired of lying in the sunshine, staying home to watch the rain, you are young and life is long and there is time to kill today. And then one day you find 10 years have got behind you. No one told you when to run, you missed the starting gun. So you run and you run to catch up with the sun, but it's sinking, racing around to come up behind you again. The sun is the same in a relative way, but you're older, shorter of breath, and one day closer to death. Now, those aren't the most encouraging lyrics, but it's the same point being made in this chapter, right? Life is repetitive. You chase the sun, and the sun sneaks up on you from behind. The wind blows and it blows day after day. Rivers keep flowing into the ocean just like they have for the past 1,000 years. And this constant repetition is exhausting. Look at verse 8. All things are wearisome, more than anyone can say. The eye is not satisfied by seeing or the ear filled with hearing. Why don't you floss every night? And I know you don't. Why don't you floss every night? It's not because flossing is hard. It's because flossing is boring. Right? The same mundane bedtime routine every night, and sometimes you're like, I don't feel like flossing tonight. Netflix has more than 3,600 movies and more than 1,800 TV shows, and yet it's impossible to find anything to watch. Why not? Well, verse 8 tells us, because the eye is not satisfied by seeing. Do you realize there are more than 100 million songs on iTunes, and yet there are days when there's nothing I want to listen to? Because the ear is never filled with hearing. We have these limitless appetites, they're never satisfied. Today should be a national holiday because it kicks off the NFL season. Right? 32 teams all competing to win the Super Bowl. If my team is the Vikings, see, it shows a purple name tag. If your team wins this year, mine won't, I guarantee it, they never do. But if your team wins this year, will you be happy? Yes, you will, right? You'll wear your t-shirt to church, your championship Super Bowl t-shirt. Will you be content? So if your team wins the Super Bowl this year, then you'll be content even if they lose every game next season, right? In fact, your team never has to win another game because they win the Super Bowl this year. You'll be totally fine with that, won't you? Of course you won't. You see, because the world is repetitive, what we long for is novelty. But here it says there's nothing really new. Now maybe you're thinking, well, there are some new. My great-grandparents didn't have an iPhone. They didn't have a flat-screen TV. But your great-grandparents talked to people, and they watched things that were entertaining. And so maybe the form is new, but the substance is not. Nothing fundamentally changes who we are. Even a new medicine that comes out that can give us a couple years can't make us immortal. Look at verse 9. What has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done. There's nothing new under the sun. Can one say about anything, look, this is new? It has already existed in the ages before us. Nothing new under the sun is a way of saying that the more things change, the more they stay the same. Like you may look out at a sunrise from a new window in your new house, but it's the same sun. Do you struggle at times with the monotony of life? It's why we love Fridays, right? Because the weekend is here. And the weekend breaks up the routine. And we can do all these fun things. And then Sunday night we find ourselves in the kitchen making lunches again. Because it's back to the grind. This is why we so desperately want to experience something novel. But the problem with novelty is that the moment you experience it, it's no longer novel. Right, have you ever painted that room in your house? And like for the first couple weeks, every time you walk by, you sort of stop and you look at it and you're like, it looks sharp. What happens after 3 or 4 weeks? You've forgotten about that room in your house. It doesn't mean anything anymore. The novelty has worn off. It always does. C.S. Lewis wrote, he said, the pleasure of novelty is by its very nature more subject than any other to the law of diminishing returns. Right? Every time we do it, it's a little less novel. Right? But why do we long for novelty? We long for it because life is tedious. Look at verse 11. There is no remembrance of those who came before, and of those who will come after, there will also be no remembrance by those who follow them. You live, you die, and you are forgotten. Or as a friend summarized it for me, he said, no one remembers it was done. No one remembers who did it. No one will remember you doing it, and no one will remember that you were even here. Do you know your great-grandfather's name? Do you know where he was born? Most of us don't. So this is my reality, that people will eat barbecue at my funeral. I'm putting that in the will. And before the smoky goodness has left their taste buds, somebody will move their stuff into my office. This summer, the owner of the Indianapolis Colts was asked about signing his star running back, Jonathan Taylor, to a new contract. And for some reason, he got really philosophical with his answer. But here's what he said. He said, if I die tonight and Jonathan Taylor is out of the league, no one's going to miss us. The league goes on. We know that. The National Football League rolls on. It doesn't matter who comes and who goes. See, your life ends because life is fleeting, but the world moves on because life is repetitive. Here's truth number 3. Life is perplexing. Life is perplexing. See, certainly if someone were to pursue wisdom and knowledge, then life would become more predictable and orderly, right? The accumulation of wisdom does not take all the mystery and perplexity out of life. The writer of Ecclesiastes, who may or may not be Solomon, he doesn't give us his name. He certainly, though, wants us to think about the life of Solomon, to see that wisdom and understanding don't guarantee that life makes sense. Right? Solomon, this great king, given so much wisdom, he ended his life as a fool. So human wisdom has limitations because it exists under the sun. Look at verse 12. I, the teacher, have been king over Israel and Jerusalem. I applied my mind to examine and explore through wisdom all that is done under heaven. God has given people this miserable task to keep them occupied. I've seen all the things that are done under the sun and have found everything to be futile, a pursuit of the wind. You know why Ecclesiastes is helpful? It's because it describes the world not as we wish it were, but as it actually is. It doesn't sing about rainbows while the tornado blows through the house. The author of this book asks big questions. He asks hard questions. He asks troubling questions. He asks questions that we need to wrestle with. And yet, in spite of all the questions, he still struggles to understand how the world works. It seems to all be vain and meaningless, at least from his perspective, under the sun. That's a phrase he'll repeat 29 times throughout this book. And the reason it seems so worthless is because no matter how wise you get, there are certain problems you can't fix. Look at verse 15. What is crooked cannot be straightened. What is lacking cannot be counted. You and I are morally bent. We are crooked. We can't fix ourselves. We make bad decisions, and those problems caused by our decisions, they're like Humpty Dumpty. They can't be put back together again. Now, the astrophysicist Stephen Hawking, he said this. He said, we are just an advanced breed of monkeys on a minor planet of a very average star, but we can understand the universe. That's got to be one of the dumbest statements I've ever heard. Like, we can understand the universe? The more we learn, the more we realize how little we know. Like, if we can understand the universe, why isn't everyone here perfectly happy? The reality is we can't even understand our own hearts, much less the universe. We don't know what we need or what makes us happy. In his quest to find wisdom and understanding, the writer of Ecclesiastes in verse 17 says as he tried both wisdom and foolishness. So he gave himself, he said, to everything he thought was foolish to see if that's where meaning was found. He's like Bill Murray's character in Groundhog Day. So in that movie, the character replays the same day over and over for 33 years. And he tries everything to get out of this sort of mundane existence, stuck in a loop day after day after day. And so he begins by trying things that are beautiful. He learns language. He learns how to play the piano. That doesn't work. So then he gives himself over to hedonism, just whatever he feels like doing. And there's a scene where he's smoking a cigarette and drinking from a pot of coffee and insulting people. Still not meaningful. It says he even tries to end his life. That doesn't work. Nothing gives him meaning. Now look at verse 16. I said to myself, see, I have amassed wisdom far beyond all those who were over Jerusalem before me, and my mind has thoroughly grasped wisdom and knowledge. I applied my mind to know wisdom and knowledge, madness and folly. I learned that this too is a pursuit of the wind. For with much wisdom is much sorrow. As knowledge increases, grief increases. Everything he attempts just makes him more empty. He's pursuing the wind. Now, we'll see his attempts in the next chapter to find meaning in much greater detail. But I want you to think about this phrase in verse 17. It's one he uses throughout the book, pursuit of the wind. I want you to picture a young child who invites you to go outside with him to catch the wind. You're not sure what that means, but you say, oh, that sounds fun. He seems excited. I'll do that. So you go outside, and he hands you an empty peanut butter jar, tells you to take the lid off. And so you're standing there, empty peanut butter jar in one hand, lid in the other, and he's the same way. All of a sudden, the wind starts blowing, and he takes off running, and all of a sudden, he slams to a stop, and he puts the lid on top, and he screws it up, and he says, I got it. Hands it to you, and he asks for the other empty one. The process repeats itself. So you have these two now sealed peanut butter jars, and you go inside the house, and he asks his mom for a marker. And he says to you, can you write the date and the time on the jar? So you've got them. Then he takes the jar in each hand, and he leads you to his room, and he adds these jars to this massive collection of empty peanut butter jars, all with a date and time written on them. At first, maybe you think, oh, this is sort of a cute little pastime. But then he takes you to another room, and you see his dad's collection, which is much bigger than his, and his mom's collection. And then he says to you, we have the best wind collection in the world. Someday we're going to sell it, and we're going to be rich. I mean, is he serious? Does he not know what's going to happen when he takes the lid off? See, all of us are that little boy. We're trying to catch the wind in peanut butter jars. See, and we mark these jars with important dates, like, oh, that day I graduated. Or we moved into our first house. Or I got that job I'd always wanted. Like, but what does our collection really amount to? Like, what have we gained for all of our efforts? Like, are we just sitting here surrounded by a collection of empty peanut butter jars? These are the things we thought would make so much difference. If that just happened, then everything would be great, but it just was empty. Like, we think, oh, that was the thing, that if that happens, then they'll respect me. If this happens, then I'll know she loves me. Like, if we can just have this amount, then we'll be secure. Like, this will, if I'm able to do this, this will give me meaning and purpose. All I need is that to be successful. But they're just empty. They're the wind in a peanut butter jar. I've been tempted all week to end the sermon right here, because I think it's important for each one of us to sit in the uncomfortable honesty of this question. What have I gained from all my effort? Is my life just a collection of empty peanut butter jars? See, we need to sit with important questions because our tendency is to avoid them through busyness and noise. Like, we escape asking these questions by filling our life with mindless activity. I mean, how silly is that? How foolish that we don't ask real questions about our life. And so I challenge you this week to sit with this question. What have I gained from all my effort? I won't end here, though, because I want to give you a glimpse of hope in the middle of this uncomfortable honesty. Who wrote the book of Ecclesiastes? Was it Solomon? Was it someone else? See, that's what people ask when they read verse 1, and I think it's the wrong question, because I don't think the inscription is really supposed to make us wonder about the author as much as we're supposed to think about God's promises. So, where does the inscription of verse 1 cause us to look? Well, it says, look at the line of David, the line from which the Messiah would one day come. So that's the very first introduction of this book, is to cause us to look to the line of David. And as we're thinking about the coming Messiah, I want you to consider what Ecclesiastes describes here in chapter 1. It describes for us life outside the Garden of Eden. It describes the world after sin and rebellion has damaged it. There's imagery from the beginning of the Bible that's present throughout this chapter. So in verse 3, you have human labor under the sun, or human toil under the sun. The words man and vanity share the same roots as the names Adam, the first man, and Abel, the first human to die. And then look at verse 13. The word there translated people is literally the phrase sons of Adam. So the life that's being described in chapter 1, and really throughout the book of Ecclesiastes, is life that has its roots in human rebellion and to the curse of God on humanity because of our sin. That's what verse 13 is referring to when it talks about the miserable task that God has kept us busy with. It's talking about when God looked at Adam and said, by the sweat of your brow you will work the land, and it will not give you what you want it to. Like, that's the setting. But think about this, the curse was not the only thing that God gave out in the garden. God also gave a promise that one day he would mend everything sin broke. And he would do it through a son that he would send, through someone that could come and restore everything that was shattered. And so we learn in each book of the Old Testament, beginning with Genesis, more and more about the Son, the only hope for us to move back into the garden from where we live now. We know that he will come from the line of King David. But then I want you to think about what the wisdom books do for this quest for the Son. So in the book of Proverbs, you have King Solomon. He's writing a book that's teaching his son, who will sit on the throne after him, so his royal son, he's teaching him how to live with wisdom. But near the end of the book of Proverbs, Solomon's son admits that he's not wise, that he's just a fool. I want you to listen to what he says. Now, this is right at the end of Proverbs, right before the book of Ecclesiastes. Solomon's son says this, I am more stupid than any other person, and I lack a human's ability to understand. I have not gained wisdom, and I have no knowledge of the Holy One. Who has gone up to heaven and come down? Who has gathered the wind in his hands? Who has bound up the waters in a cloak? Who has established all the ends of the earth? What is his name, and what is the name of his son, if you know? And so here at the end of Proverbs, you have this royal grandson of David who admits he's not the Savior because he's a fool, that he has no understanding, he's not wise. But then he asks these series of questions, and these questions reveal what he understands is necessary for someone who could actually do this. If someone is actually going to come and they're going to bring us back into the garden from this cursed world, what must they be like? Well, listen to his questions. He implies in his questions that this one would have had to have been in God's presence, and that he would have to have the power to gather the wind in his hands. And he basically says, I'm not the one, but he's the one you need. And so Ecclesiastes follows this book. And it begins by reminding us of the coming Messiah. And so maybe we go, well, maybe the one writing this book, maybe the author of this book, he's the one. He's the one who will lead us back into the garden. No. We learn from chapter 1 that this author has never traveled above the sun. That he isn't able to catch the wind. He's tried. That the royal son of David who wrote this book, he's unable to bring us back to the garden. He's not able to do the new work. He has nothing new to offer. The new work is necessary to reverse the curse of sin, the curse that makes this life fleeting and perplexing and repetitive. Okay, but there will be one day. And that's the hope here. That one day there would be this royal son of David who would come from above the sun. And he would have the power to catch the wind in his hands. In fact, we know he would just stand up and speak, and the wind would do his bidding. And though there might not be anything new under the sun, this royal son of David would descend from heaven, and he would bring with him a new thing. He would bring a new covenant and a new birth and a new life, and he would promise a new heavens and a new earth for his new people. And as wise as Solomon was, this Messiah will far surpass him in wisdom. He has the power to straighten what is crooked, and because of him, the righteousness we lack will not be counted against us. Philip Ryken wrote, he said, almost every verse in Ecclesiastes shows us how much we need a Savior to make all things new. See, in the honest portrayal of life outside of the garden, we're confronted with our need for Jesus. See, brothers and sisters, what this world needs is for us to be honest about what's wrong with it. In the last 2 weeks, a professor at UNC was shot and killed. Another student at NC State took their life. And if we pretend everything in life is easy, or we just escape into our games and our entertainment, into work, into vacation, into social media, instead of dealing with real problems and answering real questions, then we will have nothing to offer. But when we're honest about the world and we've wrestled with our own brokenness and then we've looked to Jesus as the only hope to deal with this mess, then we have something to offer. The wisdom of this world offers no hope for relief, but the foolishness of the cross leads us back to the garden. That's what Ecclesiastes wants to show us. Will you pray with me?